Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the 11th biannual Caribbean Regional Group of the Institutional Structural Engineers Conference. This morning on your program might have opening speaker, but we've done a little shifting around, and we are canceling that. And we are giving Professor Richard Robertson an extra hour to speak. I forgot to tell you that. Okay. Our first presenter this morning, Professor Robertson, is a Vincentian geologist. If you all know anything about St. Vincent, it's very volcanic. Last year, we had an eruption and some excitement. We don't often get that, so you should be glad that you were around to see it. I'll not take up too much of his time. I'll just introduce him straight away and let him come and tell us all about volcanic hazards in the region.
Yeah. Hello? Yeah, right. Okay, good. So, yeah, it's probably telling that this is the second talk I'm giving. We don't have volcanoes erupting very often. We had one erupt last year, it's probably telling. And that picture there, apart from sort of telling you what it's talking about, it actually tells you a lot about volcanic hazards in the region. And you tell me I have an hour, so I'm taking my time now. You shouldn't tell me that. It actually speaks to essentially what this talk is about and what you guys have to deal with. We live in a multi-hazard environment. The very nature of volcanic small islands is that they create in unstable slopes. Fundamentally, they create mountains that want to go into the sea. That's the first thing. So this picture here is Soufriere on the left-hand side, Richmond Peak on the right, the villages of Chateaubelair on the you actually have a thing in this, right? Yeah. Chateaubelair and Fitzhughes, that's the volcano here that erupted last year. That's Richmond Peak, the next youngest volcanic center. And essentially most of the volcanic islands going from Grenada, the inner arc all the way up to Saba and Statia, have at least one, or sometimes, if you're unfortunate like Dominica, you have several of these mountains that from time to time they explode. But because they explode, they create these landscapes, which is, I mean, that's a beautiful landscape, isn't it? It's a lovely place to go and therefore live. That's why it's a lovely sheltered harbor. But every now and then that mountain explodes and it sends nasty things down the slopes that could easily get into here. If you remember in 1902, Saint-Pierre, in one of the most famous eruptions in the world, in fact, why we as volcanologists know about these nasty things that they call pyroclastic flows, so we call them pyroclastic density currents now, is because of Mount Pelée eruption in 1902 and Saint-Pierre, where in an equivalent sense, Mount Pelée was like here, and Saint-Pierre was like here, okay? And you would think that Saint-Pierre was safe, because the distance here is about 5 kilometers, and then you have this nice sheltered harbor. Most of the stuff will go in that direction. But what happens in Saint-Pierre, what happens with pyroclastic density currents sometimes is that, yes, they follow the slopes, but sometimes they overtop little mountains. So in the case of Mount Pelée, the material went into the sea and then it came around the coastline and it came into Saint-Pierre. So one of the things that we were worried about when this eruption happened is people living in this community here. Because if the eruption gets big enough, this little hill here would make a difference in terms of the pyroclastic flows. That would make a difference, but not this one. So easily stuff could come from here and just jump over that little hill and get into the valley and basically trash everything. So multi-hazard environment, small islands, limited resources, unstable slopes. You have lots of loose material that could come down as landslides. If you're building, you find it hard to find bedrock to actually build your house and hard rock, so you have to go through that loose material. Often there will be thick soils, thick, nice, rich volcanic soils, which people, you know, there's a lot of farming on the mountain. Before the eruption, the farming was mostly ganja farmers more than anything else. The ganja farmers got shades. They haven't really quite gone back yet because the thickness of deposits after the eruption is so much that the soil hasn't reestablished itself. Vegetation is difficult. You're talking about 5 and 6 meters of material that's on the mountain currently. So inherently, you live in a landscape that is prone to a number of hazards. And when volcanoes again are unique in that they don't produce one thing. So they create a landscape that could be potentially hazardous. But also when they erupt and they do various things, not just one thing. They're not just producing one hazard. So it's a complex environment to deal with in the first place. Right, so I kind of mentioned some of this. In the Caribbean, we have 21, depending on how you count each mountain, volcanoes that we believe can erupt. And we think they can erupt because of a number of things. Either they have very young rocks, so the rocks are probably less than 10,000 years old. Because they have had some sort of seismic activity, magma trying to come to the surface often shake the ground and create these earthquake swarms that we have from time to time. So they have had some sort of severe earthquake swarms. Or else, as it is now, they exhibit some kind of activity. Often, magma, when it comes through and tries to make its way to the surface, has a lot of gas with it, and the gas would make its way to the surface, or either directly or indirectly through whatever bedrock it has, and you'll have it creating these hot springs. And in fact, why we have so much soufrieres in the region is because the word soufriere comes from a derivative of the French word for sulfur. So we have La Soufriere in St. Vincent, we have La Soufriere in Guadeloupe, we have soufrieres in Montserrat, lots of soufrieres, because at the summit you have these hot springs and fumaroles. Or else it does experience all of the above. So that's why we know that we have at least 11 of these volcanoes have exhibited these signs, and that tells us that they could probably erupt in the future. 6 of them have erupted in the last 400 years, Kikim, Jenny, Soufriere Hills, La Soufriere in Guadeloupe, Montpellier, St. Vincent, Soufriere. I'm missing one, am I? And yeah, Soufriere Hills in Montserrat. Right? So you've had eruptions from. So again, one of the problems, speaking everything at once, in the region is that because of the fact that we are independent territories, we perceive of the problem that we have in an individual way. So if I was looking at this region as a geologist, we have a volcanic hazard problem. But if you're in Barbados, you don't have any volcanoes, you don't have a volcanic hazard problem. If you're in Montserrat before the eruption, you didn't, because the eruption had never happened, and the eruption had never happened. So we think because of the fact that we ourselves, the volcano hasn't erupted very often in our territory, we discount the possibility of it and we discount the hazard because we think individually. So in a sense, our individuality as independent nations work against us in the context of not only volcanic hazard, but earthquake hazard too. Because the earthquake hazard, if you look at it regionally, is a bigger problem than if you look at it individually. In terms of activity that we expect, even when the eruptions are not happening, there are activity that could potentially be hazardous, what I call non-eruptive activity. So you can have intense earthquake swarms, even though volcanic earthquakes generally don't generate as much energy as tectonic earthquakes, and therefore they don't cause a lot of damage. They can in localized areas. If you have communities on the volcano itself, you could have an intense enough swarm that could cause the same kind of wrong shaking that you have with large earthquakes that could cause damage. So you could have earthquake swarms, you could have gas venting from fumaroles, you could have landslides, and as St. Vincent's experiencing now, you can have these mud flows or lahars. So even when it's not erupting, it's hazardous. When it's erupting though, it's even more spectacular, it's even more dangerous. So that's Caribbean volcanism in summary, and that's a nice picture to show you how in case you haven't seen the mountains, how they look. And I'd encourage you to go and visit them. So Mount Liamuiga in St. Kitts, previously it used to be called Mount Misery. They changed the name a couple of years ago because Mount Misery is not a nice name for a mountain. Nevis Peak, Nevis is a Chichen island that's in a volcano. When Nevis erupts, there's no way to go, you just have to leave the island. And if you think of it as a nation, that's a fundamental problem. Montserrat, more than 1/3 of Montserrat is now unoccupiable. It's a huge, and that was the area that was most occupied. Its eruption is still ongoing in the sense that there's no eruptive activity, no material coming out of the surface, but the volcano is still doing things that makes it hazardous to go back in the areas. Dominica have quite a lot. Sorry, I should say in red are the eruptions that you've had. Volcanic has had two phreatic eruptions in its historical period, in the 1880s and in 1997, where the areas where you have hot springs, I believe it was Valley of Desolation in 1997 one, there was an explosion and that created ash. No magma came out, but it produced ash that went as far as Portsmouth, sorry. And then Soufriere, this is the one that's been sort of most active. Apart from Kick and Jenny, you see lots of red there. The volcano that's most active and been most eruptive is La Soufriere in St. Vincent. And then you have the Soufriere Volcanic Center, which, any St. Lucians in the audience? No? Right, yeah. You guys love to say you have a drive-in volcano, right? Yeah, you have but the interesting thing in St. Lucia is that when you go down into Soufriere, what you speak about as the drive-in volcano, and you think that you go into Soufriere and the sulfur springs is the volcano. The volcano is, once you go down into Soufriere, the entire area is a complex, a volcanic complex. And in fact, I think you have some of your most vulnerable assets there. You have some huge hotels there, don't you? Right. And that entire area, if anything happens, you'll have to just evacuate, and the economic damage will be significant, I would think, if anything happens in terms of seismicity. And those kinds of volcanoes that haven't erupted for a long time, we'd expect that their period towards eruption, and in fact management of possible eruption, becomes very problematic, because it will be very uncertain, just like in Dominica, when exactly the magma will come out and specifically where it will come out from. In the case of St. Lucia, it could come out from anywhere within an area that we call the Qualibo Caldera, which includes Grand Piton, Petit Piton, that whole area there. Magma could come to the surface anywhere in that area, and we wouldn't actually know until the activity starts. In the case of Dominica, the whole southern part of Dominica, when you have seismic swarms, you have so much volcanoes close to each other. Where the magma actually comes out, that would be a problem to determine specifically. So therefore, we'd expect that long before that, months before that, you would have periods where you'll have intense earthquakes and probably phreatic activity, steaming, and no actual eruptive activity that could potentially kill someone, but would be so dangerous that you'll have to move people out. And if you think of that, you'll have to evacuate people for months and have to deal with that. And it's going to be a big problem. Right, and so I'm looking at the hazards now. So I was saying that when volcanoes erupt, they do various things. And one of the things that probably is easier to deal with is when they come out effusively, when they are not explosive. And this is the two pictures, one of Soufriere in St. Vincent, La Soufriere, and it's how it started as a small sort of classic rounded dome and slowly extended. Once it starts extending laterally like that, it moves from being what we call a lava dome to a coulee, which is a sort of a cross between a lava flow and a dome. So it's not a rounded mountain, it's kind of a long mass of rock. Typically, lava domes look like this. This is Montserrat Soufriere Hills in the night. They glow because the material there is quite hot and it's incandescent. It looks like it's flowing, but it's not really. What's happening there is that when it grows, bits of it become oversteepen, and then it fails. And when it fails, it scrapes off the surface of the failed. They're basically creating a little gully, and the gully digs into areas of the rock that is much hotter. And therefore, in the night, it really creates a very spectacular show. The problem with these mountains is that there are high temperatures. They're because of the density and velocity, they exert a lot of pressure on the areas that they're growing in. So they're prone to failure. And if they're growing within a crater, where you have a crater wall, you then become worried about the stress that's being caused by the growth of that mountain on the crater wall. So one of the issues we had during the eruption last year was the extent to which this crater wall here, even if it just continues growing as a dome without anything else, the extent to which the weight and the pressure of that material on the wall could cause it to fail. So, you have to deal with even though the lava domes are not dangerous inherently and lava flows move slowly, the problem is that they could exert pressures in the areas that could cause stress and failure. And then when they fail, they then produce things that are not so nice to deal with. So the problems with lava flows is the stresses that they create and the high temperatures that they have, which could cause fires. So that's lava flows. The things that are most dangerous with volcanoes in our region, in subduction zones, are the explosions that they can have. And this is a sequence of pictures taken from a paper done by Tim Jewett in 2002, which was looking at what was happening in Montserrat. In Montserrat, I think in 1997, they had a sequence of explosions. I think they have up to 30 or 40 explosions over a period of 2 or 3 months. And essentially what happens, because of the nature of the material, you had some sort of explosion happens, the explosion then builds up initially, and I'm showing the pictures because the hazards associated with explosive eruptions, you see in all of them here. Initially when the explosions happen, fragments of rock come out as these ballistic blocks, we call them projectiles, ballistic projectiles. They're hot rock that gets blasted out because of the explosion. They could be up to 1 meter in thickness. They're hot, so they could ignite roofs and things like that. We'll look at that later on. And then eventually, as the explosions continues, an eruption plume develops that then will sustain itself for a certain time, but as it runs out of energy, it starts failing and it falls back on itself and creates these pyroclastic flows. These flows of hot rock, fragments of crystals and gas that moves down this mountainside very, very rapidly. And that's extremely dangerous. Eventually, this will develop into a plume that probably gets into a plume like that will then go with the wind and it falls back as ash. So that in a sense is how explosive eruptions occur in our region. They start small, an explosion that continues as the volatile material expands, develops into a plume that collapses on itself, produces pyroclastic flows, and it continues to grow. And that's how it looks in reality. If you think of the picture before, that's kind of in fact, the paper was explaining what was happening here. So you have the plume going up in the air, eventually it will mushroom out as it gets to a point where it runs out of energy for expansion upwards. It reaches some topographic, stratigraphic barrier, it spreads out, and it moves in the direction that the wind carries it. The hazards associated with explosive eruptions are projectiles, ashfall. I look at them, each of them, pyroclastic density currents, lateral blasts, volcanic earthquakes, lahars. I'd actually look at the projectiles, ashfall, PDCs, and lahars more so than the others because they're all related. Now, one important thing to bear in mind is that within this are fragments of ash, and that's how an ash particle looks like in a scanning electron microscope. The unfortunate word for the thing is ash, and when we think, well, not so much probably you guys, you folks, but when the public think of ash, they think of organic carbon, soot, when you burn something. So you got that, you think of it as ash. But the ash in a volcanic context is nothing to do with carbon. It's crystals, is fragments of rock and crystals. So they're fundamentally very abrasive. They're hard, they have a certain amount of hardness. They have little pockets in them because what has happened is that a bit of magma has come out and it has gas within it as a fundamental part of its structure. As it gets fragmented and gets pelted up in the air, it cools. And the little pockets of gas that was in the magma comes out and forms these little holes, these things we call vesicles. And again, it's being exploded, so it's being abraded even further, so it's broken up into smaller and smaller bits. And the further and further away you go from where the center is, the finer material gets further. That's why, for example, you had so much fine ash in Barbados. And in fact, that's why Barbados will always, apart from the initial harassment of the ash, the first 2 days or 3 days or weeks or whatever it is, it could be worse. Months after, you benefit from it because that fine material is lots of crystals that the soils need and like, and once they weather, it creates conditions that are quite good for your farming. So that's what explosions do. They create high velocity plumes and disperse volcanic fragments, and that's how the particles, the individual particles would look if you look at them in very high magnification. And that's a plume from the 1991 explosions I spoke about in Montserrat. So looking at projections, one of the problems with, and I'll just leave that up, you could read it, just telling you something about the different size particles and things like that. One of the problems with studying volcanic products is that and especially with projectiles, if you want to figure out what projectiles are doing, it's hard because you can't really go towards the area where the projectiles are affected. You have to stay away, so you have to look at it remotely. And therefore, trying to look at the impact of projectiles usually, and in fact, any kind of volcanic deposit depends on going in as soon as possible after and examining what effects it had. And a lot of the work that has been done recently on projectiles has been done experimentally by some, this guy, well, not so much, this is from Jenkins, but this one is from a guy called Williams who set up an experiment to look at how the different angle of trajectory of the projectiles, how it affects things. But let's go back. Right, so this is looking at the likely ranges of and impact energies required for projectiles to penetrate roofs. So one of the things I was saying that projectiles can penetrate roofs of different kinds. Of course, the stronger the reinforced concrete roof is going to require much more energy than, say, the glass. So obviously, the stronger the material that you have, the less likely for that bomb. Essentially, the projectiles are like little bombs that are falling from the sky. They will be hot, they will be hard, and they initially, one of the things is that the material that they have to pass through actually slow them down. And the nature of the material itself, depending on the strength of the material, you have different thicknesses in terms of size of the projectile and the different range of energy that you require to penetrate it. So a reinforced concrete slab would require a much higher energy, much faster moving projectile, a much bigger projectile to penetrate it than, say, a glass or tile or timber and things like that. Right? So in terms of your construction material, obviously, but obviously your concrete roof for other kinds of hazards is not such a good thing. So one of the challenges in designing, I guess, in this region is that you have to design for different kinds of hazards. So if you design for projectiles, it might mean that it counters something that you have to do for a different kind of hazard. So that's something to bear in mind. So I was showing this before, and this is some work that this guy Williams did, which is looking at both the angle, and it's showing you here how, depending on the angle of the projectile, essentially the steeper the angle of the projectile, the less likely for it to penetrate the roof. If it's falling from more or less directly above, it's more likely to do that. But one of the interesting things in terms of this here, he was showing how even areas where, for example, and all of these people shouldn't be where they are if they're being affected by projectiles like this. They should have been evacuated. But if you were, it shows you how different things that you can actually do that could minimize the chances of you being harmed. So, for example, getting onto something, staying on the side of the building that is further away from where the volcano is, rather than this side, and I'm basically trying to get under. You want to slow down the rate, because once it hits here, it's going to start losing its energy, so that the chances of it penetrating that other layer there is less. So it shows how, for example, even if you're in areas where you shouldn't be, you could minimize, save your life partly. If you're outside, for example, rather than sort of covering like this, you should put something over yourself if you have to go. And you stay on that side of the building rather than this side, because the material is coming from that direction, essentially. So just in his work, he's just showing you how you could actually protect yourself even in situations where you shouldn't be. And this graph here is showing you how the impact energy, which is down here, of projectiles, as soon as they hit, basically the amount of energy they have to continue moving decreases. So basically, once they hit something, they lose their energy. That's why if you put more barriers between you and the projectile, your chances of surviving is greater. So those are projectiles. The next thing that we want to look at is tephra, or these fragments of ash that go into the atmosphere. And this is just showing you two pictures. That's from St. Vincent last year, and this is from Soufriere Hills in Montserrat a couple of years ago, in 2009. And again, there's usually an ejection of fragmented material. It goes up into the atmosphere, and as it runs out of energy and it meets some resistance to the atmosphere, it starts spreading out, and then it falls back down. This one is a time lapse. That's where you could see the incandescence of the material. So if I was seeing this this is in the day, if I see this eruption in the night, I would probably see lots of red material in it because of the glowing. In the day, because of the sun, we don't really see it. And going through this is some of the impacts that ash would have. So one of the first things is the fact that the ash has a weight, it will load material. So the loading of the ground, it could essentially cause structures to fail. So the loading of the ash, the weight of the ash itself. Then, I mean, of course, the loading, the thickness of the ash relates to the loading, but the important thing is that the thickness of the ash generally decreases away from the vent. So usually it should exponentially decrease. So as you move from the center, as you move away, it should decrease exponentially. Well, again, we're in Barbados, and I'll tell you an interesting thing from research we've done, is that because of the nature of Soufriere itself, the topography around Soufriere affects the distribution of the ash and the way in which the ash moves away from Soufriere. And the modeling that we've done, given the atmosphere in Soufriere and the weather conditions in Soufriere and how Soufriere itself as a mountain affect the circulation of winds, it says that anytime Soufriere erupts, more than likely Barbados will have an unusual thickness of ash. Your thickness of ash and the amount of ash you will have would actually be thicker than it should be, given how far away you are. So something to bear in mind. So whenever you look at ash distributions, you could have as thick ash as some places in St. Vincent would have, which you shouldn't, because you're further away. You think that as you come south from Soufriere and St. Vincent, you should never have as much ash as, say, Kingston. But you probably would have more ash than Kingston, which is in the south, sometimes depending on what the conditions are. Okay, this dispersion of the ash is over a wide area, and often there's what's called remobilization. This is remobilization of the ash. Essentially, the volcano would have been falling, producing ash. This is in an area called Belmont in St. Vincent. And what you see in here is that the vehicle has probably moved up the valley and it's remobilized the ash. So in addition to the ash that's deposited from the primary eruption, there's a lot of ash that gets remobilized, and that's a problem after long, and it could go on after. Both by wind as well as by rain. In the case of rain, when it gets remobilized, it produces lahars, which we'll come back to. The grain size is another important factor. Smaller particles disperse further and can penetrate smaller openings. So that again, if you think of being far away, like in Barbados, you would have had finer ash which would have gotten into further spaces. So than, say, if you were in St. Vincent and you were on the volcano, the material you have there is coarser grain. So it wouldn't probably get into as much spaces, as much fine spaces as, say, the ash that fell here. So there's another factor. So it's both its thickness as you move away from the vent will decrease, but also the grain size will decrease. And then another factor is the surface chemistry. Particles are often coated in soluble salts. And when water mixes with that, those soluble salts produce acidic and potentially corrosive material. So, your steel material, if you have the wet ash on it, you then start having corrosion. So quite apart from the weight, once the ash gets wet, which also increases the weight, when the water passes through it, it dissolves these salts and you then have corrosion. And then apart from all of that, it's highly abrasive. Because of the hardness. I spoke about that before. So this is some of the effects that it had. That has damage to building, that has damage to agriculture. In areas in close proximity to the volcano, the weight of the ash itself caused trees to fail. That's a tree that is broken, not because somebody cut it down, but because of the physical weight of the ash and the leaves during the eruption. Eventually the tree fails. So that's ash. And this is some of what I was saying. Generally, ash decreases as you go away from the center. And you could define certain zones where close to the volcano, it's quite destructive. And I mean, it's going to be life-threatening. It's going to be difficult to live in the areas quite close to the volcano. But as you go further away, it moves from being damaging to being just more of a nuisance. And that's kind of how you could think of the impact of the ash as you move further away. Of course, it's going to have wider impact, especially for aviation, because planes don't like to fall in ash. This picture is to show you how ash can be generated both from explosions. This is two sources of ash. This one is going up in the air, and that's from an explosion that Soufriere volcano is somewhere in that direction. So it's produced an explosive eruption plume, but there's a pyroclastic flow that went down the valley that's creating this. So pyroclastic flows has what we call coined bright ash plumes that go with them. So the flows are going down the valley, generating an ash plume that rises up in the air. Sorry. Right, so the next one I want to look at is pyroclastic density currents. That's an all-encompassing term that we now use to include things that are very dilute, which is called surges, as well as things that hug the valley, which are called flows. And one of the main things is the dynamic pressure. That's the amount of kinetic energy that you have that's being exerted over a particular area because of the flow. So that's one of the key things. It's usually quite high. It's tens of kilopascals. And it could cause damage and destroy buildings. Basically, when flows going down the valley, there are very few engineered structures that will survive it. I'll show you the next slide where in Montserrat, because of a lateral blast and a flow, you basically just shaved off the entire top foundation of a concrete structure, and it's just the base you get at the end. They could be extremely destructive. There are run-out distances that they can flow quite far distances. We in the region, because we live in small islands, they get to the coastline in a round of energy. But there are places where they could go to several kilometers, tens of kilometers. In Marapi in 2010, pyroclastic density currents killed people who were 10 or 15 kilometers away. They were evacuated and they got killed. So if you think of that, that's going the distance of some of the islands that these volcanoes are in. The temperatures are quite high. They're sufficient to burn most common building materials. And again, the pyroclastic density currents are made up of fragments of rock, bigger particles of rock that went up into the plume, as well as crystals and gas. And this picture is a picture of Laracai. There were two valleys in St. Vincent where the pyroclastic density currents came down. And all of that is new material that was created. All of that white stuff that you see in there is new material. So this came down as deposited material on the coastline. And when it was coming down, it probably would have looked something like this. This is Montserrat in Plymouth. When the pyroclastic density currents hit the sea, they boil the water and they continue going. In fact, it's actually spectacular to see them. They'll be coming down at a certain rate, 100 kilometers an hour. They hit the coastline and then they hit the sea and they boil the water. And because they boil the water, they then create a situation where there's frictionless flow. And what will happen is that they will hit the sea and then they will suddenly just shoot in that direction. The speed increases because they don't have the resistance of the ground anymore. And that's one thing. When we think of the hazards from volcanoes, we think of them stopping at the coastline. They don't stop at the coastline. They go extend further. So in Montserrat, there's an exclusion zone outside. So if you had a boat, if you were here, you're out there and there are people that have incidents, then wasn't a good idea. You went sightseeing, you go with your boat and you stay outside the coast and you're looking at the pyroclastic flow and it's coming on the mountain, you could see it. And if you're in the day, it looks like a very benign cloud that's coming on the mountainside, and you really, oh, this is spectacular. And then suddenly it hits the sea and it starts shooting towards you. It's hot material, it's boiling the sea, it's boiling this bottom surface there, and it's moving towards you very fast. Not a good place to be. In 1902, when people, from the 1902 eruption, there are cases of people having burnt. There are people who were still in the volcano. They would have tried to go into the sea when the pyroclastic flow come down. They tried to go into the sea and stay down as long as possible. Some of them eventually had to come up and they got burnt. Some of them got killed. So at the coastline is not a good place to be because they move very fast. So those are pyroclastic density currents. And this is just some pictures of it. I was telling you about how corrosive and how destructive they are. This is a place called Harris in Montserrat. In 2010, there was a collapse of the northeastern segment of the volcano. And a blast, basically a lateral blast, is essentially, you could think of it like a pyroclastic density current that is much more energetic. That is, it's almost like instead of the volcano had an explosion, it went up. It had an explosion, it went sideways, essentially as well lateral blast. So a lateral blast came down. The volcano is somewhere over here on the left, probably about 4 or 5 kilometers away. It came down and it came into this village called Harris, which was for a long time quite pristine, far enough away from the volcano. And it just blasted things out of the way. You could see buildings up here. There was a police station somewhere up here that ended up, we're not seeing it here, but the police station, all you found was sort of the base of the police station. But you could see all the damage that's happened here. This is from a pyroclastic density current. one of the things that they do is that they tend to cause, this is some work from a guy called Blong. If you're looking at people who have done a lot of work on the impact of volcanic hazards, Blong, I think he's a Australian, New Zealander, has done a lot of work on it. And he's showing you how the different kinds of material require sort of obviously reinforced concrete slabs require a lot more energy for you to have any damage caused by these flows going over them. And as mentioned, you know, the impact of the flows would be burns, scoring, burial. This is why people die. Buildings are destroyed. I mentioned that damage is due to the dynamic pressure, the temperature, the duration of the flow, the amount of solids that you have in it. Basically, it's a rapidly moving mass of solid material and gas. One interesting thing is that buildings particularly are vulnerable because of the openings. What happens is that even if the flows are not going very fast, if you have a lot of you know, doorways and openings in the buildings, the hot gas gets in and it causes fires to form, which will then burn the building if the building didn't come down. So that's one of the things that from work in Montserrat is discovered. So if you think that was all, after the eruption has happened, the volcano produces all this loose material. And we live in the tropics, and whenever rain falls, it creates these things we call mud flows, or lahars. Lahars is they come from, it's an Indonesian term because lahars were first sort of noticed, they have some big lahars in Indonesia. Basically, they're mud flows, flooded river. And the problems they have is because of the speed, they can travel high velocities, very fast, damage, destroy buildings, infrastructure, anything in they follow the river valley mainly, and so therefore they could destroy anything in the river valley itself. But they could slush over the river valley. In fact, you could see how high they can get. This is in, I believe that's Wallabo River on the western side of the volcano. This is in an area called Sandy Bay, some of the lahars that came down in the early days of the eruption, soon after the explosion was finished, the first set of rains. But the dark colors on the buildings tell you how high the water mark was. So you see where the water got to. Got to here, it got to up there, and it basically undercut the foundation. There was a bridge, there's a road that went across here, damaged the road, damaged several buildings. Unfortunately, people lived in the valley. Shouldn't live in the valley, but they did, because didn't have any lahars for a long time. So they're quite erosive. They're commonly erosive, destabilized foundation, as it's doing here. They can, just like pyroclastic density currents, but probably less so. They can move long distances. In Chile, they can go, there are lahars that come from one of the volcanoes in, not Chile's, in Ecuador, I was thinking of actually, that go 20 and 30 kilometers out, and they're huge, massive deposit they create. They can be tens of meters in thickness in terms of the material that they lay in the valleys, and they generally occur after an eruption, and they could keep on going for a long time. And St. Vincent is learning that now. Every time there's rain in St. Vincent, the rivers get flooded, and if you're familiar with the road network in St. Vincent, they certainly on the volcano itself, you basically have to go, all the roads cross rivers. So once the rain falls in St. Vincent now, the rivers come down, and you have to stay on one side. And for some crazy reason, people think that they could still go across with the vehicles, and they get stuck all the time, and the tractor has to come and pull them out. I think the government currently have taken the approach where they've got some Bailey bridges from St. Lucia borrowed or something like that, and they're now putting in some Bailey bridges, which is supposed to solve that for a certain time. This is a picture from Montserrat. This is the Bellum Valley, one of the biggest valleys that come down. The volcano is up there, and it shows you how anybody used to go to Montserrat in the old days. They used to have a golf course here once. That's now overrun by the river. Those are lahars. And finally, again, one of the things that volcanoes do is accumulate material. So if you go to Plymouth now, you'll see this. If you went to Plymouth I guess before 1995, when I first went to Plymouth, one of the classic features was this clock tower here, which over the years has gotten buried. You can't really see it anymore. I think they eventually retrieved the top and they have it up in the north somewhere. But basically it got buried, accumulation of deposits. So that's how the clock tower looked. That's how it looked in 98, 2002. It's now gone. It's not there anymore. It's buried on there. I think they have taken away the top of it and carried it up north. But that's what happens. That's what Plymouth looks like. That's how Plymouth used to look. That's what Plymouth looks like now, more or less. But we live in islands that, the interesting thing when I speak to people is that that's what created the islands. This process is why we have the islands. This process continues going. We tend to think that because of our lifetime, it wouldn't happen in our lifetime, but that's how it happens. That's how these mountainous areas created these nice flat areas that we then go and live on and you know, agriculture and things like that. But we can't discount this. I could have easily superimposed this picture on Roseau in Dominica. Roseau in Dominica, you have all the mountains here, and Roseau in Dominica is a pyroclastic fan. This is what we call a pyroclastic fan. It's a fan of material that has been created by pyroclastic flow deposits. The capital of Dominica is built on something like that, which tells me as a geologist that it's a matter of time. It will eventually look like that at some point in time. Right, so getting to the end now. So when we're thinking of looking at managing volcanic risk, exposure and vulnerability to volcanic areas will increase as populations increase in volcanic areas. So we need to understand more volcanic risk. We, as people in my field, we understand a lot about the hazard. We know what pyroclastic flows do. We know where they do them. We know how often volcanoes can erupt, things like that. What we don't know very much about is the risk, because to do the risk, you have to know a lot more about the exposure and the vulnerability, and that's usually a challenge, and that requires folks like you in the room to understand how structures behave, how they respond to volcanic material, and we don't know enough about that. We're very good at this. You know, there's a lot of hazard assessment, volcano monitoring, early warning that's going on, but to reduce desensitizing impacts, we need to get into more of the risk. We need to be able to estimate the risk, the impacts on infrastructure in a more systematic manner. We need to be able to go in when eruptions have happened. They don't happen very often, and understand how they have affected the structures that you have. And that's one of the things that we've been doing. This is a slide from a colleague of mine, Victoria Miller, who's doing some work on St. Vincent. Hopefully she'll be publishing it soon. But this is just some comments that she wrote. One of the things that she found is that the internal wood panels provided simple roof strengthening to sheet material in the places where she was. So people putting up these wood panels help the roof to survive. In addition, concrete internal roofs provided some support, but less, if not continuous, to the roof. You know, people tend to put up concrete barriers in their house, but sometimes they don't carry it to the roof. So if you carry it to the roof, you help to strengthen your roof. So things like this. People use a lot of decorative blocks to increase the airflow, but that means that a lot more ash could come in. So we need to go in after and sort of estimate and understand what happens. And I guess for you guys, you need more of this kind of thing, fragility, determining fragility functions. I think this is from TEFRA. There's a lot of work that's been done on ashfall in places like Vesuvius, in some of the other regions in the world, where they looked at what is the chances of failure of buildings and structures depending on what they're stressed by. These are vulnerability curves developed, I think, by Jenkins. No, this is Williams, the same guy with the bombs I was showing you. From 2014 Kelut eruption in Indonesia, they show the probability of a building experiencing different stages of damage depending on the amount of weight, the amount of tephra that you have in it. So you need that so that you can determine what's the best kind of building, what the best kind of structure to use. We don't have very much eruptions in the region, so whenever there's an eruption, you need to make use of that, as well as from other parts of the world. Okay, so I think I'm on the second to last one now. So I'm going to issues. So as I was saying, quantitative volcanic hazard assessments, they are well advanced, so we know where the volcanoes can erupt. We generally know, in the region, we have volcanic hazard maps for all the islands. We don't think they're being used, given what we've seen, and where people are putting structures. Well, governments do. But we need quantitative vulnerability assessments. These are lacking. We don't know how vulnerable the things are, the societal infrastructure and critical infrastructure are, so that we could get risk done. There obviously no guidelines exist for engineers regarding construction and design to mitigate volcanic hazards, and that's probably a gap that we could fill in the region given what we know. And in fact, we don't really quite know what sort of information and what format would be most beneficial, accessible. What was it engineers need in the context of where we operated? The type and location of structural damage, this is something that Vicky sent to me to say that both the location of the structural damage is important, so how the structures fail, but also we need to look at non-structural damage and the lasting impacts. The fact that you can't use, for example, in St. Vincent, you didn't have water for a certain time, that affected other things. So you didn't have electricity, that affected other things down the line. And my final words, I see you coming to tell me I need to stop talking. I did warn you about the hour here. Volcanoes are multi-hazard environments. I think I said that expose vulnerable communities to a range of possible impacts. Volcanic risk is dynamic. It's not static. And it is a regional, not an Eastern Caribbean problem. As I said, we tend to think of it individually. But when the ash happens, it affects aviation throughout the region. It doesn't affect aviation in St. Vincent alone or in Montserrat alone. And currently, in my estimation, the regional ash hazard is not understood. We don't fully understand if one volcano erupts or two volcanoes erupt in the region. We don't know exactly what will happen, what impact it will have at a regional scale. And I put it to you that it will have a regional impact. One volcano erupted last year for only two weeks, and it shut down St. Vincent Airport. I think it shut down Barbados too. Yes. Right? It affected St. Lucia, Grenada. One volcano, 2 weeks. It wasn't a big eruption. Soufriere eruption, what we estimate, was smaller than 1902. So it's bigger than 79. It is not the biggest eruption that Soufriere can have. And it is certainly not as big as eruptions that we'd expect from Dominica. So we don't understand that, and that's to me a serious problem. And the rest of that you could read. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.